"Sir, this seat isn't for you." The words landed flat, cold, and final, cutting through the low hum of the aircraft like a blade no one else could hear, but everyone immediately felt. The cabin had already begun to settle into that quiet pre-departure rhythm. Overhead, bins clicking shut, the faint scent of recycled air, the soft murmur of passengers adjusting themselves into leather seats that cost more than most people's monthly rent. And in the middle of it all, standing just inside the first-class aisle, was Darius Coleman. He didn't move. Not right away. His hand remained loosely wrapped around the handle of his carry-on, the worn leather slightly creased from years of use. Not designer, not flashy, just practical. The kind of bag that didn't ask for attention. The kind of bag people overlooked. Much like the man holding it. The flight attendant beside him shifted her weight, offering a tight, rehearsed smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We'll need you to take your assigned seat in economy, sir." Her voice was polite, but there was an edge beneath it, something firm, something already decided. Around them, a few passengers glanced up, then quickly away, the way people do when they sense something uncomfortable unfolding but don't want to be part of it. A man in a tailored navy suit paused mid-scroll on his phone. A woman across the aisle adjusted her sunglasses, though the cabin lights were dim. No one said anything. No one ever did. Darius exhaled slowly, the breath measured, controlled, like someone used to choosing calm over reaction. He had felt this before. Not the exact moment, not this exact plane, not this exact seat, but the weight of being misjudged, the quiet assumption pressed onto him before he ever spoke a word. It lived in small pauses, in second glances, in decisions made just a little too quickly. His eyes moved briefly across the cabin, not searching, not pleading, just observing. The polished surfaces, the chilled glasses waiting on tray tables, the subtle divide between who belonged and who didn't. "I believe there's been a mistake," he said finally, his voice even, steady, carrying no anger, only clarity. The flight attendant's smile tightened. She glanced toward the front of the cabin, toward the cockpit door that had just opened with a soft mechanical click. Footsteps followed. Measured. Confident. Captain Ryan Whitmore stepped into view, his uniform crisp, his presence filling the narrow aisle with an authority that didn't need to be announced. His gaze moved to Darius, paused, assessed, and in that brief second, something unspoken passed between them, something old, something deeply ingrained. "Is there a problem here?" the captain asked, though his tone suggested he already believed he knew the answer. The attendant gestured lightly. "Seat confusion," she said. Whitmore's eyes returned to Darius, cooler now, sharper. "Sir, we need to keep this flight on schedule," he said. "If your boarding pass says economy, that's where you need to be." There it was. Simple, clean, final. A decision made without checking, without verifying, without asking anything beyond what he saw. A few rows back, someone let out a quiet chuckle, quickly stifled. Another passenger leaned slightly into the aisle, curiosity flickering across his face. Darius felt it all, the attention, the judgment, the invisible line being drawn around him in real time. But he didn't step back. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. Instead, he stood there, still as the plane itself before takeoff, his fingers relaxing slightly on the handle of his bag, his posture straight, grounded, unshaken. Outside the small, oval window beside him, the runway lights stretched into the distance, glowing against the fading evening sky, steady and unwavering. Inside, the air felt tighter, thinner, as if the entire cabin was holding its breath, waiting to see what he would do next. The silence stretched just a fraction too long, the kind that pressed gently against the ribs and made even the quietest sounds feel louder than they should. Darius Coleman shifted his weight slightly, not out of discomfort, but out of habit, grounding himself the way he always had when the world around him started making decisions about him without his permission. The handle of his carry-on felt familiar in his palm, the smooth leather worn down in places where his fingers had rested 1,000 times before, in airports, in boardrooms, in places where he had learned early that presence alone was never enough. He had grown up watching his mother move through spaces like this, though never quite inside them. She cleaned terminals overnight, long after the last flights had taken off, when the polished floors reflected only fluorescent lights and silence. He remembered sitting on a cold plastic chair near gate B12, legs 2. short to touch the ground, watching her push a cart that squeaked with every turn. She used to tell him, in a voice soft but certain, that how people saw you was not always who you were, and that one day, he would walk through the front of places that only opened their back doors to her. The memory flickered and faded as quickly as it came, replaced by the present, by the steady gaze of Captain Whitmore, who had already begun to lose patience with a situation he believed should have resolved itself by now. "Sir," the captain said again, this time with less restraint, "we cannot delay departure over a seating issue." The words were reasonable on the surface, almost procedural, but there was something underneath them, something dismissive, as if the situation itself was beneath further consideration. Darius nodded once, slow and deliberate, acknowledging the statement without accepting the assumption behind it. "I understand the importance of timing," he replied, his voice calm, measured, carrying just enough weight to be heard without forcing attention. He did not raise his boarding pass. He did not step aside. He simply remained where he was, present, steady, as if the ground beneath him belonged to him just as much as it did to anyone else on that aircraft. A faint vibration ran through the cabin floor as ground crew equipment shifted outside, a low mechanical hum that blended with the distant whine of engines preparing for departure. The overhead lights flickered slightly, then steadied, casting a soft glow across polished armrests and pressed suits. A man across the aisle leaned back in his seat, arms crossed now, watching more openly. Another passenger adjusted her scarf, her eyes lingering just a second longer than before. The attention had shifted. It always did. Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to be felt. The flight attendant glanced between Darius and the captain, her earlier confidence now edged with uncertainty, as if she sensed that something about this moment was not as simple as it first appeared. "If you would just step aside," she offered again, softer this time, almost cautious. Darius looked at her briefly, not with defiance, not with frustration, but with a quiet clarity that held its own kind of gravity. "I am exactly where I am supposed to be," he said. The words did not rise. They did not push. They simply settled into the space between them, firm and unmoving. Captain Whitmore exhaled through his nose, a subtle sign of impatience, and glanced toward the cockpit, as if calculating how much longer he was willing to entertain this interruption. To him, this was a delay, a minor disruption in an otherwise routine process. To Darius, it was something else entirely. It was a moment he had lived in different forms his entire life, a test not of authority, but of composure, of whether dignity could hold its ground when everything around it suggested it should step back. The cabin seemed to narrow, the aisle tighter, the air heavier, as if the space itself was waiting for resolution. But Darius did not rush it. He had learned a long time ago that some moments revealed more in silence than they ever could in argument. And so he stood there, still and unwavering, as the quiet tension continued to build, unseen but unmistakable, like pressure gathering before something shifts. Captain Whitmore's jaw tightened just enough to be noticed, not by everyone, but by those who understood the subtle language of control slipping, even if only by an inch. He was a man used to compliance, to quick resolutions, to the quiet efficiency of people stepping aside when instructed. This was not that. His eyes moved once more over Darius Coleman, slower this time, more deliberate, as if reevaluating a detail he had already dismissed. The hoodie, the worn carry-on, the absence of anything that signaled urgency or status in the way he expected to recognize it. It did not fit the pattern he trusted, and because it did not fit, he had already decided it did not belong. "This is not a discussion," Whitmore said, his voice lower now, controlled, but edged with something firmer. "We have procedures for a reason." The word procedures lingered in the air, carrying with it the weight of authority, of systems designed to prevent exactly this kind of disruption. Darius listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, but his eyes steady, focused, absorbing every word with a quiet attention that did not challenge, yet did not concede. He had spent years in rooms where decisions were dressed in language like that, clean, efficient, justified. He recognized it immediately. Around them, the cabin had shifted again, not in volume, but in awareness. A woman in the second row leaned slightly forward, her fingers paused above her phone screen. The man in the navy suit had stopped pretending not to watch. Even the soft ambient music filtering through the cabin speakers seemed to fade beneath the tension that now sat between two men standing less than 3 feet apart. The flight attendant took a small step back, her role in the moment quietly receding as the dynamic changed, as if she understood that whatever happened next would not be resolved by polite repetition. Darius adjusted his grip on the handle of his bag, not tightly, just enough to settle it, a small movement that grounded him in the present. He could feel the faint vibration of the aircraft through the soles of his shoes, the steady pulse of a machine preparing to move forward, even as everything inside it remained paused. He glanced briefly toward the open cockpit door, where a panel of instruments glowed softly in the dim light. Indicators steady, systems ready. Everything about the plane was prepared for departure. Everything except this moment. Then let us follow them correctly, Darius said, his voice calm, unhurried, each word placed with intention rather than force. There was no challenge in his tone, no escalation, only a quiet insistence on accuracy, on fairness, on something that should have been simple. Whitmore's gaze sharpened, the slightest flicker of irritation crossing his face, not explosive, not dramatic, but present. He was not used to being met like this. Not with defiance, not with submission, but with something in between that refused to bend without ever pushing back. It disrupted the rhythm he relied on. A soft chime sounded overhead, signaling that the boarding process was nearing completion. Somewhere toward the rear of the plane, a flight attendant called out a final reminder about securing carry-on items. The normal flow of pre-departure continued, but it felt distant, secondary, as if the center of gravity had shifted entirely to the front of the cabin. Darius reached slowly into the front pocket of his hoodie, his movement deliberate enough to draw Whitmore's attention without triggering alarm, and pulled out his phone. The screen lit up against his palm, a clean, bright contrast to the muted tones of the cabin. He did not wave it. He did not present it as proof. Instead, he looked down at it briefly, his thumb moving once, precise, controlled, as if sending a message that required no hesitation. Then he lowered it again, slipping it back into his pocket with the same calm restraint. The action was small, almost unremarkable, yet something about it shifted the air in a way that could not be easily explained. Whitmore noticed. He could not have said why, but he did. There was a pause, subtle but real, a fraction of a second where certainty hesitated. "Last chance, sir," Whitmore said, though the confidence behind the words was no longer as absolute as before. Darius lifted his gaze, meeting the captain's eyes fully now, not confrontational, not aggressive, but unmistakably present. "I am not in the wrong place," he said quietly. And this time, the silence that followed did not feel like pressure building. It felt like something already set in motion, something moving beyond the narrow aisle, beyond the cabin, beyond what either man could immediately see, but very much on its way. The faint hum of the engines deepened, not loud, but steady, like a low note held beneath everything else, reminding everyone on board that time was still moving forward, whether this moment resolved or not. Captain Whitmore glanced once toward the cockpit, then back at Darius Coleman, as if weighing the cost of continuing versus the cost of conceding. His fingers brushed briefly against the edge of his uniform sleeve, a small, habitual adjustment, the kind people made when they were recalibrating without admitting it. "We are done here," he said, more firmly now, the decision returning to his voice. "You need to step out of this aisle so we can close the door." The words were final, structured, meant to end the situation cleanly. A few rows back, a soft sigh escaped from a passenger who had been watching too long, the kind of quiet impatience that came from people who expected their schedules to matter more than anything else. Darius did not react to the shift in tone. Instead, he reached again into his pocket, slower this time, and brought out his phone once more. The screen illuminated his face briefly, casting a cool glow across his features, highlighting the calm that had not left him since the moment this began. His thumb moved across the screen with precision, opening something, confirming something, the motion practiced, deliberate. He did not angle the device for anyone else to see. He did not need to. The action itself was enough. The flight attendant's eyes flickered toward the phone, then back to Darius, a trace of uncertainty settling in where confidence had been just minutes before. "Sir," she said, softer now, almost careful. If there is an issue with your ticket, we can resolve it at the gate. It was an attempt to redirect, to move the problem away from the cabin, away from the audience that had quietly gathered in the form of watching eyes and held breath. Darius looked at her, his expression unchanged, but there was something in his gaze now that carried a quiet finality. "It is already being resolved," he said. The words were simple, but they landed differently this time, not as a request, not as a defense, but as a statement of fact. Captain Whitmore's brow tightened slightly, just enough to show that the shift had registered. "Resolved by who?" he asked, the question coming faster than his earlier statements, edged with a hint of skepticism that had not yet turned into doubt, but was no longer entirely certain. Darius held his gaze for a brief second, then looked past him, toward the open cabin door, toward the narrow passage that connected the aircraft to the terminal. "By the people responsible for making sure this flight operates correctly," he replied. The answer did not raise its voice. It did not explain itself. It simply existed, leaving space for interpretation, and that space began to stretch in a way Whitmore did not fully control. A soft tone chimed from somewhere near the galley, followed by a brief crackle of static over the intercom system, subtle, almost easy to miss, but not to someone trained to hear changes in routine. The flight attendant nearest the front glanced instinctively toward the panel, her posture shifting as if waiting for a call that had not yet come. Outside, through the narrow gap of the open door, the distant movement of ground crew slowed, one of them pausing to look up toward the aircraft, as if receiving new instructions through a headset. It was small, almost nothing, but it was not nothing. Whitmore noticed it. His eyes moved briefly, just for a second, toward the door, then back to Darius, and in that single glance, something changed. Not fully, not visibly to everyone, but enough. "This is unnecessary," he said, though the certainty in his tone had begun to thin, like a line drawn in sand just before the tide shifts. Darius did not respond immediately. He simply slipped his phone back into his pocket, the motion smooth, controlled, final. Then he adjusted his stance slightly, not stepping back, not stepping forward, just settling into the space as if he had no intention of leaving it. The cabin felt different now. The earlier curiosity had turned into something quieter, more focused. People were no longer just watching. They were waiting. The air itself seemed to hold on to the moment, stretching it, suspending it, as if something just beyond view was about to enter the frame. And for the first time since this began, Captain Whitmore did not speak right away. He stood there, measuring, reassessing, the rhythm he relied on no longer entirely in his control, while the quiet, steady presence of the man in front of him remained unchanged, grounded, and unmistakably certain that this moment was no longer moving in the direction anyone had first assumed. The pause that followed was no longer empty. It carried weight, like something unseen had entered the room and quietly taken control of the air. Captain Whitmore felt it before he could explain it, a subtle shift in the rhythm he had relied on for years, the kind that made instinct hesitate just long enough to be noticed. He straightened slightly, his posture tightening as if to reclaim authority through precision alone. "We are closing this door," he said, turning halfway toward the flight attendant, signaling an end to the exchange without formally acknowledging it. "Prepare for departure." The attendant hesitated, just for a second, her training pulling her forward while her intuition held her back. "Captain," she began, her voice lower than before, cautious, but he cut her off with a small, controlled gesture. "Now." The word landed firmly, but it did not travel as cleanly as it would have minutes earlier. Somewhere beyond the open door, a sharp tone sounded over a headset, followed by a quick exchange of voices that did not match the routine cadence of boarding completion. One of the ground crew members who had paused earlier stepped closer to the aircraft, his gaze lifting again, more focused this time, as if waiting for confirmation he had not yet received. Inside the cabin, a faint ripple of movement passed through the seated passengers, subtle shifts in posture, phones lowered, conversations stilled entirely. The moment had stretched too far to be ignored now. Darius Coleman remained exactly where he was, his presence unchanged, his breathing even, his eyes steady. He did not look toward the door. He did not look at the passengers. He simply stood, grounded in a way that made everything around him feel slightly off balance by comparison. The flight attendant near the galley pressed a button on the panel, responding to the earlier static, and a quiet voice came through, too faint for the cabin to hear clearly, but enough to change her expression. Her eyes widened just a fraction, then shifted immediately toward Captain Whitmore. "Captain," she said again, this time with urgency she could not hide. "We have a call from operations." Whitmore exhaled sharply, irritation flickering back to the surface, but there was something else now, something less certain. He turned toward the panel, stepping away from Darius for the first time since the exchange began. The distance was small, only a few feet, but it changed the dynamic instantly. He reached for the intercom, pressing the receiver to his ear, his voice low as he responded. "This is Captain Whitmore." A pause. His expression remained firm at first, composed, but as the voice on the other end continued, something in his face shifted. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, the tightening around his eyes, the slight stillness in his shoulders. He did not speak for a few seconds, listening, absorbing, recalculating. The cabin watched without appearing to watch. Darius did not move. He did not need to. The hum of the engines continued, steady, indifferent, but now it felt like a background to something larger unfolding. Whitmore's grip on the receiver adjusted slightly, his fingers pressing more firmly against it, as if trying to anchor himself in the conversation. "I was not informed," he said quietly, the edge in his voice replaced with something more measured, more careful. Another pause, longer this time, the kind that did not belong in routine communication. The flight attendant nearest him held her breath without realizing it, her eyes fixed on the captain, waiting for direction that no longer seemed immediate. Outside, the ground crew member stepped back, speaking quickly into his headset, his posture alert now, no longer casual. Whitmore lowered the receiver slowly, not abruptly, not dramatically, just controlled, deliberate, but the shift had already happened. He turned back toward the cabin, toward Darius, and for the first time since this began, his gaze did not carry assumption. It carried recognition, incomplete, but undeniable. The air in the cabin changed again, the tension no longer building, but settling into something heavier, something real. Darius met his eyes, calm as ever, his posture unchanged, his presence steady, as if he had known from the beginning that this moment would arrive exactly like this, not with noise, not with force, but with quiet clarity that could not be ignored. The cabin no longer felt like a place in motion. It felt suspended, as if time itself had slowed to match the quiet unfolding of something deeper than a simple disagreement. Captain Whitmore stood still for a moment after lowering the receiver, the faint echo of the voice from operations still lingering in his mind, reshaping the certainty he had carried into this interaction. The edges of his authority had not disappeared, but they had softened, recalibrated by information he could not ignore. He drew in a slow breath, the kind that filled the chest but did not fully settle, then released it just as carefully, his eyes drifting briefly toward the instrument panel visible through the open cockpit door, where steady lights blinked in calm, unbothered patterns. Everything in the aircraft was functioning exactly as it should, yet something in this moment had revealed that not everything had been seen as it should. Darius Coleman remained where he was, the quiet center of a situation that had finally caught up to itself. The overhead lights cast a soft reflection across his face, outlining the stillness in his expression, the patience that had never broken, not even when the pressure had been at its highest. His hand rested lightly against the handle of his carry-on, fingers relaxed now, no longer adjusting, no longer grounding, simply present. The flight attendant nearest the galley stepped back from the panel, her posture more attentive than before, her earlier confidence replaced with a careful awareness that something important had shifted beyond her role. A faint murmur passed through the cabin, not voices speaking, but the collective awareness of passengers who could feel the change without fully understanding it. A man in the second row lowered his phone. Completely, no longer pretending to be distracted. A woman across the aisle adjusted her posture, sitting straighter, her attention fixed on the front of the cabin with quiet intensity. Outside, the ground crew had stopped moving altogether, one of them standing just beyond the edge of the doorway, headset pressed firmly against his ear, waiting, listening. The world beyond the aircraft had paused to match the world within it. Captain Whitmore turned back toward Darius slowly, not with the sharpness of command, but with the measured pace of someone stepping into a realization he could not rush. Their eyes met again, and this time there was no assumption in Whitmore's gaze, no immediate judgment forming behind it. There was only recognition beginning to take shape, incomplete but undeniable. He took a step forward, then stopped, as if reconsidering the distance he had placed between them earlier, as if understanding that proximity now carried a different meaning. For a brief moment, neither man spoke. The silence between them was no longer tense in the same way. It had changed, deepened, carrying weight not from conflict, but from understanding arriving slowly, piece by piece. Darius shifted his gaze slightly, not away, but toward the open door, where the fading evening light stretched across the edge of the cabin floor, casting long, soft shadows that moved almost imperceptibly as the sun lowered beyond the horizon. The light touched the polished surfaces, the uniforms, the seats, and finally settled across the space between the two men, as if drawing a line that had been there all along, just unseen until now. He inhaled quietly, the breath steady, controlled, then exhaled just as slowly, the motion subtle, but grounding, as if releasing something that no longer needed to be held. Captain Whitmore noticed it, not the breath itself, but the calm behind it, the absence of urgency, the quiet certainty that had never wavered. It unsettled him more than any raised voice could have. He glanced once more toward the intercom panel, then back to Darius, the decision forming not from pressure, but from recognition. The cabin remained silent, the hum of the engines continuing beneath everything, steady and constant, a reminder that movement would come again, but not yet. Not until this moment had fully revealed what it was meant to reveal. And in that stillness, with nothing left to interrupt it, the weight of what had been assumed began to settle into what was now understood, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet clarity that filled the space more completely than any words could have. Captain Whitmore's lips parted slightly, as if a response had formed out of habit, but no words followed immediately. For the first time since the moment began, he did not reach for authority as his first instinct. Instead, he stood there, absorbing what had already shifted beyond his control. The message from operations had not been vague. It had been precise, structured, unmistakable. A name, a title, a level of oversight that did not belong to ordinary passengers. And now, standing just a few feet away from him, was the man he had already judged, already placed, already dismissed without verification. The realization did not arrive all at once. It settled slowly, like light breaking through a cloud, revealing what had always been there, but had gone unseen. His posture changed, not dramatically, but enough. The squared shoulders softened. The rigid line of his stance eased just slightly, as if the weight he had carried as certainty was now something he needed to reconsider. "Mr. Coleman," he said finally, and even the way he spoke the name carried a different tone than anything that had come before. It was no longer dismissive. It was no longer procedural. It was careful. The cabin seemed to draw in a collective breath, subtle but shared, as if the recognition itself had a sound, even if no one spoke it out loud. Darius did not respond immediately. He simply looked at Whitmore, calm as ever, his expression unchanged, but his eyes steady in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. He did not confirm the name. He did not deny it. He did not need to. The silence between them held the truth clearly enough. Whitmore took a small step closer, then stopped again, as if aware now that proximity required more than authority to justify it. His gaze flickered briefly, not away, but downward, a momentary break in the directness he had maintained earlier. "It appears there has been a miscommunication," he said, choosing the word carefully, though it felt smaller than what had actually occurred. The phrase hung in the air, thin against the weight of what everyone had just witnessed. A few passengers shifted in their seats. The earlier curiosity now replaced with a quiet awareness that something significant had unfolded in front of them. Darius tilted his head slightly, not in challenge, but in acknowledgement, as if he had heard that explanation many times before, in many different forms, dressed in different words, but carrying the same meaning. "It was not a miscommunication," he said softly, his voice even, controlled, and unmistakably clear. The words did not rise, but they settled into the space with a weight that could not be dismissed. Whitmore held his gaze, and for a brief moment, there was no defense in his expression, only the recognition of something he could not correct with procedure or authority alone. The engines continued their low, steady hum beneath everything, but now it felt distant, secondary to the quiet shift happening inside the cabin. Outside the open door, the fading sunlight stretched longer across the tarmac, the orange glow reflecting faintly against the aircraft's interior surfaces, softening edges, blurring lines that had once seemed sharp. The flight attendant near the front stood still, her hands lightly clasped now, her earlier instructions forgotten, her focus entirely on the exchange unfolding in front of her. Darius adjusted his stance slightly, not to move away, not to step forward, but simply to settle, as if grounding himself in the moment now that it had fully revealed itself. "You made a decision," he continued, his tone unchanged, not accusatory, not emotional, but precise. "Before you had all the information." Whitmore inhaled slowly, the breath measured, as if he were choosing how to respond not as a captain, but as a man who had just been shown the limits of his own assumptions. The silence returned again, but this time it was different. It was no longer tension. It was understanding, quiet and undeniable, filling the space where certainty had once stood. And in that stillness, with every eye in the cabin quietly witnessing, the balance of power had already shifted, not through force, not through volume, but through truth that had finally been seen. Captain Whitmore did not respond immediately, and that silence carried more weight than anything he could have said in that moment. His eyes remained on Darius Coleman, but the way he looked at him had changed completely, no longer searching for confirmation, no longer measuring him against a surface-level impression, but recognizing something deeper that had been overlooked from the very beginning. The word miscommunication still lingered in the air, fragile now, unable to hold its shape under the quiet clarity that had replaced it. Whitmore straightened again, but this time the movement was different, not an attempt to reassert control, but an effort to stand with intention, to face what had just been revealed without retreating into authority. "You are right," he said finally, the words steady but quieter than before, as if he understood that volume no longer carried meaning here. A subtle shift moved through the cabin, not a sound, but a shared awareness that something rare was unfolding, something that did not happen often in places governed by hierarchy and routine. Darius remained still, his expression calm, his gaze steady, offering no interruption, no reaction that would make the moment easier or harder. He simply allowed it to exist. Whitmore glanced briefly toward the open door, where the fading sunlight had deepened into a softer, cooler hue, the day giving way to evening without pause or hesitation. Then he looked back at Darius, and this time, there was no distance in his eyes. "I made an assumption," he continued, choosing each word carefully, not rushing, not deflecting. "And I acted on it." The admission settled into the cabin with a quiet finality, more powerful than any command he had given earlier. A passenger near the aisle shifted slightly, lowering his gaze as if the truth itself had redirected his attention inward. The flight attendant near the galley exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing just enough to show that she had been holding tension she did not fully understand until now. Darius tilted his head almost imperceptibly, acknowledging the words without softening their meaning. He had heard apologies before, many of them, some sincere, some convenient, some too late. What mattered now was not the admission itself, but what followed it. Whitmore took a small step back, creating space, not as a retreat, but as a recognition of boundaries he had crossed without realizing it. "You should have been welcomed the moment you stepped on board," he said, his voice firm again, but grounded in something different now, not authority, but accountability. The engines continued their low hum, steady and patient, as if waiting for the human moment to resolve before continuing their purpose. Outside, a service vehicle rolled slowly across the tarmac, its lights passing briefly across the cabin walls, casting moving shadows that faded just as quickly as they appeared. Darius finally shifted, a subtle movement, his hand releasing the handle of his carry-on, his posture relaxing by a fraction. He did not step forward. He did not step back. He simply allowed the moment to settle fully before speaking. "It is not about the seat," he said quietly, his voice carrying the same calm that had never left him. It never was. The words were simple, but they reached deeper than anything else that had been said. Whitmore held his gaze, understanding arriving more clearly now, not as a realization forced upon him, but as something he could no longer avoid. The distinction was undeniable. This was not about first class or economy. It was about what had been seen and what had not. A long breath passed between them, shared in silence, the kind that marked the end of something unspoken and the beginning of something understood. The cabin remained still, every detail sharper now, the leather seats, the dim lights, the quiet presence of people who had witnessed a shift that went beyond policy or protocol. And in that stillness, without raising his voice, without demanding anything, Darius had already changed the direction of the moment, not by force, but by holding his ground long enough for the truth to catch up. No one spoke for a long moment after Darius Coleman's words settled into the cabin, and in that silence, something deeper than resolution took shape. The tension that had once filled the narrow aisle did not snap or disappear. It dissolved slowly, like mist lifting from the ground as the first light of understanding moved through it. Captain Whitmore stood facing him, no longer framed by authority alone, but by the quiet weight of recognition he could not undo. The engines continued their steady hum beneath everything, patient, indifferent, ready to move when the human moment allowed it. Darius reached down and lifted his carry-on slightly, not to leave, not to retreat, but to reposition it beside him, the motion simple, unhurried, as if the outcome of this moment had never required urgency from him. His posture remained straight, but relaxed now, grounded in something deeper than the situation itself. Whitmore took a step to the side, clearing the aisle without announcing it, the gesture small, but unmistakable. It was not an order. It was not a command. It was an acknowledgement. The path that had been blocked was now open. The flight attendant near the front moved quietly, almost instinctively, her earlier hesitation replaced with a careful attentiveness. She adjusted the armrest of the first-class seat nearest Darius, her hands steady, her movements respectful, as if correcting something that should have been right from the beginning. No one clapped. No one spoke. But the shift was felt by everyone watching. Darius stepped forward then, just one step, measured and calm, his shoes pressing lightly against the carpeted floor as he moved into the space that had always been his. He did not look around for approval. He did not acknowledge the eyes that followed him. He simply walked with the same quiet certainty that had carried him through the entire moment. As he reached his seat, he paused briefly, his hand resting on the top of the seat back, the leather cool beneath his fingers. For a second, his gaze drifted toward the window beside it, where the last light of evening stretched across the runway, long lines of gold fading into deep blue. It reminded him of something distant, something older than this moment, the long path that had brought him here, not just onto this plane, but into a space where he no longer needed to explain his presence. Behind him, Captain Whitmore remained where he was, his posture still, his gaze lowered just slightly, not in defeat, but in reflection. The uniform he wore had not changed. The title he held had not disappeared, but something inside the way he carried both had shifted, subtly but permanently. He turned slowly toward the cockpit, pausing once at the threshold, his hand brushing lightly against the frame as if grounding himself before stepping back into the role he knew so well, now with a clearer understanding of the weight it carried. The cabin lights dimmed just slightly as the door finally closed with a soft, decisive seal. The outside noise faded, replaced entirely by the controlled environment within. A gentle chime sounded overhead, followed by the calm voice of a flight attendant preparing the cabin for departure, her tone steady, professional, but softer now, as if shaped by what had just occurred. Darius lowered himself into his seat, the leather giving slightly beneath him. The space around him quiet, undisturbed. He placed his carry-on beside him, then rested his hands loosely in his lap, his breathing even, his gaze forward. He did not smile. He did not look back. He simply sat, present, grounded, exactly where he was always meant to be. Outside, the runway lights flickered into full brightness as the plane prepared to move, each one aligned in perfect order, guiding what came next. Inside, the silence remained, not empty, but full, carrying the quiet echo of a moment where nothing had been forced, nothing had been raised, and yet everything had changed. And as the aircraft began to roll forward, slowly at first, then with growing momentum. The space between what had been assumed and what had been understood closed completely, leaving behind only the steady rhythm of motion and the quiet, undeniable presence of truth.